with me today. My name is Kristen Bos, and as Binta mentioned, I'm urban Métis, born and raised here in Takaranto, though my homelands are in northern Alberta in Treaty 8 territory where prairie transitions into boreal forest. It is such an honor to be here today. It is my pleasure to speak here and give the last WGSI research seminar of the term. As a graduate student at U of T, these are always my favorite events, and so I'm extra excited to be here. And this afternoon, I'm going to share some excerpts from my manuscript about how we might document, visualize, theorize, and imagine the relationship between colonial, gendered, and environmental violence in a way that doesn't rely on or reproduce violent narratives or require further data extraction in the form of stories or testimonies from those who are most affected. Beads as method is a desire-based framework and non-extractive research method that is shaped by glass seed beads, beadwork, and our relationship with them. So I want to get us started off by thinking about this question, which is, how do we research violence without being violent? I come to this question, as many have before me, as an Indigenous feminisms researcher and community member, as an ex-archaeologist who is all too familiar with the extractive methods and their violent presuppositions. Oh, sorry, I thought that chat was for me. And as a science and technology studies scholar, or more specifically from the emerging subfield of Indigenous science, technology, and society studies, which I will refer to as Indigenous STS, which Dr. Jessica Kolupenik defines as the field where, quote, Indigenous researchers are producing methodological frameworks capable of analyzing from our own standpoints about the science and technology projects that affect us, end quote. Beads' method manifests and materializes Dr. Eve Tuck's call for us as researchers to suspend damage, to let desire guide our research practice, and to create methodological frameworks that are capable of understanding the complexities, contradictions, and self-determination of lives lived through and in spite of colonialism. So for our chat today, I will do a quick research overview to provide some helpful context, and then I'll describe in 3 vignettes how I use Beads' method. The first, Beads as desire-based framework, provides the theoretical grounding for my research. The second, Beads as land or earthworks, extends the scope of bead relations with the provocation that seed beads are land, and as land, we have responsibilities to them as kin. The third, Beads as witnesses, critically investigates the extensive chemical relations of seed beads, from the raw materials needed for their production, to the settler colonial technologies that make their manufacture possible, to their contamination with organic and inorganic pesticides and preservatives in museums and cultural institutions. And here I will draw on fieldwork that I completed between 2015 and 18 in British and European museum collections. So why beads? The relationship between beading and Indigenous peoples extends across millennia. Prior to the colonization of Turtle Island or North America, pierced materials of all kinds, such as shell, copper, bone, and meteoric iron, circulated through Indigenous communities, nations, and territories since time immemorial. Following colonization, our beads took on the materiality of glass. These beads became known as glass seed beads, named in English, perhaps for their varied and small sizes, which ranged from under a millimeter to several, but no more than 5, or perhaps to echo their former life forms. Seed beads are well documented in the historical record, in colonial journals and inventories as valuable currencies, in colonial journeys and, my apologies, in colonial journals and inventories as valuable currencies, and scholarship on the production, circulation, and the role of seed beads as trade beads during the Atlantic slave trade and in the colonization of the so-called New World can be found across the social sciences and the humanities. In the popular imagination, seed beads figure in some of the most famous and pervasive settler colonial narratives. For example, Blue glass beads from Venice are one of the first gifts Christopher Columbus and his genocidal crew gave to the Taino peoples. And when Lewis and Clark set out in their custom riverboat on the Missouri River towards the Pacific Ocean, their expedition almost starved because it did not bring enough blue and white seed beads. Too bad. Seed beads come up again and again as goods given for deeds and treaties for lands across the US and Canada. And though historical studies on beads have made significant contributions to our understandings of colonial capital, transnational economies, labor practices, technologies, and governance structures, it is in Indigenous feminism scholarship and art activations where seed beads, beadwork, and beading practice are understood for so much more than just currencies or for their role in the establishment of settler colonial states, but rather as historical records in and of themselves. As Indigenous researchers, writers, and artists have demonstrated, seed beads, beadwork, and beading are coded knowledge, language, stories, maps, theories, and laws. More akin to wampum, beads made of quahog, whelk, and cowrie shells weaved into open-ended belts that guided peoples and their nations and their relations from the eastern shores of the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, narrating histories, traditions, and laws, such as the founding of the League of Five Nations. As Laura Harjo, Janelle Navarro, and Kimberly Robertson explain in their chapter on the importance of beading for our communities and as one of the most captivating and effective anti-violence strategies for movements like Idle No More, the movement to address missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in Canada, which I will refer to as MMIW, and the movement to address violence against Native women in the United States. The power of storytelling via beadwork maintains a cultural legacy that settlers have not been able to eliminate. And I desire to continue in this legacy. In academia and in communities, many people, including Two-Spirit people, trans people, and people who identify as women in many different ways, have been working with and theorizing alongside seed beads, beadwork, and beading practice. My research gathers, stretches, and draws from over 2 decades of Indigenous feminism scholarship, art activations that use seed beads and beadwork to illuminate complex histories and bright futures, and historical and archival materials. I theorize through Indigenous epistemologies that understand seed beads, beadwork, and beading practice as active, vital, and life-giving. For example, in her brilliant PhD thesis, Dr. Lana Ray explains that in Anishinaabe-Moan, the word for seed bead is Manadominans, which can be loosely translated to little spirit. Putting Indigenous feminisms, science and technology studies, environmental history, and museum studies into conversation, I propose an interdisciplinary framework for envisioning decolonial futures and collaboration towards justice. Most importantly, my research is in solidarity with anti-violence strategies for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It contributes urgently needed analyses, frameworks, and actions for other Indigenous scholars and those choosing to work in solidarity with our communities. My work makes 2 major methodological contributions. First, I approach historic and ongoing gendered violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people through material culture, or seed beads and beadwork, by engaging seed beads, beadwork, and the practice of beading as research subject, research participant, and qualitative research method, using a desire-based framework, Indigenous feminist standpoint, and harm reduction practices. Crucially, I argue that beads and their relations are a site where we can investigate colonial, gendered, and environmental violence without relying on further testimonies from survivors and their families. Second, I approach seed beads as more than human kin with decolonial relations to land, bodies, and chemicals by extending the scope of bead relations into science and technology studies, creating a new environmental data justice framework that also accounts for Indigenous material culture. There are 3 foundational concepts that guide me, and these are Dr. Eve Tuck's desire-based framework, Lev Paperson's provocation that settler colonialism is a set of technologies, which I think through alongside Dr. Ruha Benjamin's conceptualization of captivating technologies, and the Native and Youth Sexual Health Network's Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies toolkit. Though each of these foundational concepts can be found throughout my work, I'm going to speak to each of them through these 3 vignettes. I will start with vignette 1, beads as desire-based framework. On June 13th, 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit People released their final report, Reclaiming Power and Place, and Calls for Justice. The commission heard from over 750 survivors and their families, all of whom requested access to ceremonies, traditional healing practices, and wellness activities. These included visits with elders, harvesting medicines, making regalia, feasts, feeding, healing circles, land-based healing programs, hunting and gathering of traditional foods, and attending powwow, sundance, and sweat ceremonies. Recognizing beadwork as a powerful transmitter of culture and knowledge, as well as an act of resistance to colonial and gendered violence, the final report dedicates an entire section using the example of the crowd-funded and commemorative art installation, Walking with Our Sisters, pictured here. Walking with Our Sisters was a commemorative installation of over 2,000 moccasin tops, sometimes called vamps, to honor the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. As a bundle of vamps and medicines, it traveled from 2013 to 2018 and visited 27 communities across Canada. It began in 2012 when Métis artist Christy Belcourt put out a call on Facebook for people to create and send her moccasin vamps. And according to Belcourt, quote, by the time Edmonton was set to open, 1,763 pairs of vamps had arrived. 65 beading groups had sprang up. Over a dozen people had joined me on the National Collective to help organize, and thousands had been inspired to express their care and concern by either making vamps, organizing to help, or making donations. It was a whirlwind and outpouring of care and compassion. We were all feeling the same way, like we needed and wanted to do something. We needed to express our support and care for the families, end quote. For the bundle's visit to Takaranto, it was temporarily installed in the gymnasium of the Aboriginal Education Center from October 15th until October 22nd, 2017. During installation, we laid down each of these vamps on a red floor backed and lined with cedar. We laid down the vamps in a spiral path intended to mirror the Milky Way galaxy, pictured here. On a couple of afternoons, I acted as one of the greeters of the installation, asking visitors to remove their shoes, to hold tobacco in their left hand, and to put good thoughts into it, and to smudge. We all explained how the vamps were laid out in 2 concentric circles, and how to walk and move through the space in honor of both Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg protocols. In her open letter to communities, researchers, and educators, Dr. Eve Tuck calls on us to, quote, reconsider the long-term impact of damage-centered research. Research that intends to document people's pain and brokenness, to hold those in power accountable for their oppression. This kind of research operates with a flawed theory of change. It is often used to leverage reparations or resources for marginalized communities, yet simultaneously reinforces and reinscribes a one-dimensional notion of these people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. Tuck urges communities to institute a moratorium on damage-centered research, to reformulate the ways research is framed and conducted, and to reimagine how findings might be used by, for, and with communities, end quote. As Tuck explains, regardless of the researcher's intent and the political and material gains that come from trading damage-based narratives, traumatic stories, and violent points of data within a settler colonial state like Canada, where truth and reconciliation is a consumable product, the danger of damage-centered research lies in that it is a pathologizing approach. How can we approach the historic and ongoing gendered violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in a way that does not continue to just document the unimaginable, and I would argue, undocumentable, and unquantifiable pain that accompanies our lived realities as Indigenous peoples in Canada in order to hold those in power accountable for their role in our deaths, disappearances, and genocide. As researchers, we are used to having to collect more and more data, often through extractive methods, such as collecting, translating, and coding testimonies from survivors and their families. And this qualitative data gathering can be good if done with community and by community, but there have to be other ways that we can use, other methods that we can use towards justice. As an alternative to damage-centered research, Dr. Tuck suggests that we, quote, craft our research to capture desire instead of damage, unquote. She argues that a desire-based framework is, quote, an antidote to damage-centered research. An antidote stops and counteracts the effects of a poison. And the poison I am referring to here is not the supposed damage of Native communities, urban communities, or other disenfranchised communities, but the frameworks that position these communities as damaged, end quote. For Tuck, desire-based research frameworks are concerned with understanding complexity, contradiction, and the self-determination of lived lives. She encourages us to find the wisdom and the hope, and to ensure that we are seen as more than just broken and conquered. In Bea's method, there is, of course, an individual version of desire, mine and the one that I bring to this research. As a researcher who came to seed beads and beadwork in a moment where even doing research felt impossible. But there is also the desire that is neither mine nor about me, but about all of our relationships as Indigenous feminists. The desire to be sovereign in our bodies and our territories, in good relation to each other, and in deep connection with the land. I understand colonialism as other Indigenous, Black, and anti-colonial scholars like Eve Tuck, Fred Moten, Ruha Benjamin, and La Paperson do, as a horrific state-operated land-eating machine that reproduces itself through a set of technologies. And as an Indigenous feminist researcher, I hold seed beads as one set of technologies to explore, plot, and map colonial violence, but as materials and kin that can also operate within a desire-based research framework as research subject, research participant, and qualitative research method. And I will explain how I use beads as each. So how are beads a research subject? This is the easiest one to answer. It is within the traditional research methods of the Academy. And so using beads as a research subject, I am able to make feasible the investigation of a large and complex data set that is Indigenous feminist material culture and our relationships with them, and address the multidimensional and multiscalar problem of adequately accounting for the various materials, structures, and technologies of centuries of colonial, gendered, and environmental violence. For example, as made objects, seed beads can speak to histories of colonial dispossession, capital, transnational economies, labor practices, and technologies. When we bead now, the seed beads that we use are produced in factories in the Czech Republic and Japan. China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and India also produce glass seed beads, but those produced in the Czech Republic and Japan are favored. Through our intimate relationship with seed beads, we are enmeshed in the histories of these places and these factories too, which in the case of the Czech Republic matters because seed bead production actually hasn't ceased there since 1548. And when we go into that history, we become entangled with a much different but still connected forms of imperialism, colonialism, and power. For a time, Gestapo agents controlled the glass industries in these places, and the seed beads that were produced there were produced through prison labor. As I argue, we can walk alongside seed beads and watch colonialism unfold from their perspective, from the arrival of Columbus to the formation of settler colonial states to the transnational economies. However, as Walking with Our Sisters demonstrates, seed beads as made objects, which in this case take the form of unfinished vamps, also loop us into Indigenous epistemologies, ontologies, cosmologies, and futurities that settler colonialism has not been able to destroy. As a research participant, I turn to seed beads as witnesses. Though not to be confused with the genre of object biographies, I'm careful to emphasize the capaciousness of seed beads and beadwork to act with us as co-conspirators and to account for the over 5 centuries of settler colonial violence that we have experienced as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people here. As a method, this is both desire-based and non-extractive. As in Walking with Our Sisters, turning to beadwork as a witness renders violence visible, but does not require us to expose our faces, bodies, or stories. These are, of course, present, but in coded form and not for public consumption. We can do this because, as doctors Laura Harjo, Janelle Navarro, and Kimberly Robertson have noted, there exists a sacred ontology of beadwork. They explain, quote, "In many ways, it is necessary to think of the actual beads as having an ontology, a sense of being or life. For instance, the beadwork on the vamps intervenes in colonial power and violence by speaking life into a different narrative, one that does not assume racialized and gendered violence must be the script for Indigenous women and girls. As a result, the beadwork in Walking with Our Sisters is a decolonial aesthetic that works to unearth abusive settler practices against Indigenous women and simultaneously call attention to the need for this violence to end. The ontological life of the beads used for these vamps underscores the juxtaposition of silence and visibility versus voice visibility. Namely, the life-giving potential of beadwork in this memorial is rooted in the ceremonial positioning of the installation and the sacredness of the beads. Arguably, beadwork has a sense of life by helping to maintain community and acting as a transmitter of culture and knowledge," end quote. Activating this ontology brings us to beads as an ethical, viable, and qualitative research method. Drawing on her brilliant doctoral work, which was pursued as a beading project and a thesis, Dr. Lana Ray outlines how she uses beadwork and beading practice as a method of inquiry that emphasizes the values that beading generates, including respect, balance, harmony, centeredness, and repetition. She describes the activation of the value of centeredness like this, quote, "For a piece of beadwork to be balanced, it must be centered, or what some would call grounded. When a bead is sewn onto a piece of hide, it becomes grounded to that hide through its center. It also remains secure in that spot because of the knot underneath the hide that is not visible, but it is present and it is necessary. Knots in themselves are also significant because the process of knot making echoes the importance of the center. To make a knot, one must form a circle within the awl and sinew, then bring it through its center to make it strong. To ensure that I bead good beadwork, I need to ensure that I situate myself in the process. I need to ground myself in my own beliefs about the world and acknowledge these understandings in my knowledge search." Dr. Jessica Kolupanik's theoretical work reminds us that relations theorize relations. Centeredness as a part of relational accountability puts us into conversation with other Indigenous feminist theories. Dr. Kim Tallbear's Indigenous feminist standpoint, which urges us not just to care for our research subjects, but to be accountable, ethical, and reciprocal throughout our research practice. And it also foregrounds what Dr. Karen Recollet and Erin Consumo have called practices of harm reduction, which urge us to ground ourselves, to meet the lands where they're at, to meet each other where we are at through radical forms of consent, to keep our communities safe, and to use whatever tools that work best for us without stigma or judgment. I will end this first vignette with the words of Christy Belcourt. She writes, quote, "I thought at the beginning, when I first made the call out for vamps, that Walking with Our Sisters was an art exhibit. It isn't. Walking with Our Sisters defies categorization. It's a commemoration, it's ceremony, it's an honoring, it's art, it's community taking action, it's a way to demonstrate we care." End quote. By engaging seed beads, beadwork, and the practice of beading as a research subject, research participant, and qualitative research method, this project understands beads and beadwork as a living archive of Indigenous feminist material culture, which contains both material histories and accounts that reflect the settler colonial order of things, but also contain much more than material properties, to which I will now speak. Beads as land or earthworks. Here I have chosen one of Jean Marshall's pieces, Ring of Fire 2. In this piece, 7 beaded gauntlet mittens are arranged in a circle to represent the gathering of communities who must deal with the complexities of economic development and environmental degradation as experienced from the chromite mining and smelting developments proposed to exploit the mineral-rich James Bay lowlands in northwestern Ontario, which is Jean's home territory of Treaty Number 9. Beads as land or earthworks. By bringing together Indigenous feminism's practices that activate seed beads as research collaborators with the polluting practices that expose beads and beadwork to chemical pollutants, which I will come to next, my research extends the scope of bead relations with the provocation that seed beads are land. And as land, we have responsibilities to them as kin. Made of silica or sand, soda or potash, which is made of the ashes of plants, and calcified flora and fauna or lime, seed beads are direct material relatives of what land is conventionally understood to be. Understanding seed beads as land allows this project to undertake an investigation of the extensive chemical relations of seed beads through chemical pollutants, settler colonial technologies, and our responsibilities to these materials as kin. This follows Indigenous feminist frameworks that emphasize land body sovereignty, co-constitution, and non-human kin. For example, Métis anthropologist Dr. Zoe Todd reminds us that the fossil fuel economy in Edmonton, Alberta, and Treaty 6 territory, as in all places, is animated through a, quote, paradoxical kind of kin. The bones of dinosaurs and the traces of flora and fauna from millions of years ago, which surface in rocks and loamy earth in Alberta, act as teachers for us, reminding us of all the life that once teemed here when the place that we know as Alberta was home to myriad species who made life and made worlds within the lands and waters, end quote. Understanding seed beads as land also follows the recent chemical turn in the field of science and technology studies that critically examines conventional knowledge about chemicals and pollutions. By situating its analysis of beads and beadwork within critical STS and environmental justice frameworks, my project engages with contemporary Indigenous scholars and artists such as Ruth Cuthand, whose COVID piece we saw earlier and will return to, Jean Marshall, whose work is pictured here, and many others who are engaging environmental violence in their home communities and globally. I lost my place. And globally through their beadwork, from the Ring of Fire mining development and its sprawling and destructive infrastructure to contaminated waters and the COVID-19 pandemic. My project also refuses industry-generated frames of reference that limit knowledge of what chemicals are, what they do, and where to find them. Furthermore, I refuse data practices that aid industry in their efforts to cultivate doubt about climate change and the harms of chemical pollution, wherever we find it. Understanding seed beads as land is also in deep dialogue with historian of science, Dr. Michelle Murphy's concept Ultralife, which urges us to decolonize our understandings of chemicals as discrete entities and isolated molecules, and instead cultivate an understanding of our chemical relations as embodied relations that carry the intersecting and violent histories of colonialism, industrialism, and environmental racism. Seed beads are therefore not only sites of Indigenous material culture, but extensions of Indigenous lands characterized by persistence in the wake of colonial violence, resistance to ongoing structures and systems of colonial oppression, and imaginations for alternative, decolonial, and just futures. My project grapples with environmental violence by focusing on polluting practices within the context of cultural institutions. Beads as witnesses. Here I have chosen one of Ruth Cuthand's more recent works, Surviving COVID-19. I love Ruth's work because it shows us the capaciousness of beads and beadwork. In particular, her work puts colonial histories, technologies, diseases under a microscope, helping us to visualize our complex relationships with each over time. Beads as Witnesses highlights the insidious use of chemical pollutants in the historic and ongoing contamination of Indigenous material culture in museum collections and cultural institutions. Here, I draw on fieldwork that I completed between 2015 and 2018 in British and European museums and cultural institutions, the bulk of which took place in German archives and storage rooms. Hearing pests, degradation, and decomposition of biological materials such as hide, leather, wool, sinew, feathers, hair, and hoof, all materials associated with beads. Collectors and museum professionals have used numerous preservatives, pesticides, and biocides on Indigenous material culture from the 1600s onwards. Though the use of the now more well-known dangers of pesticides, such as those that come with DDT, nucleic chloride, and arsenic, ceased in most places around the 1960s and 70s as regulations started to be enforced. But these chemicals have really long half-lives. Chemical preservation practices have enduring consequences for the materials themselves, their caretakers, and the possibilities for repatriation. When I was in the archives one afternoon in Germany, the curator who greeted me looked very strange to me. She looked like we were about to go and handle toxic waste. She brought me a lab coat, apron, disposable booties, nitrile gloves, and some goggles. She only had one mask. As we walked to the elevator, she told me that she'd been having nosebleeds, pain, numbness in her fingers and toes, and migraines. She said that she went for some tests and that the doctor said it looked like she had been exposed to something, probably at a chronic or low level, but that she would need more tests. As we got inside of the elevator and pressed one of the buttons to go down to one of the basements, she told me that she no longer visited the Indian archives. She was sure that it was the Indigenous material culture, close to the African material culture, both stored together, that was making her so sick. On that afternoon, I received a little PPE for handling, as well as a reminder to take breaks above ground for fresh air. And this happened again and again, but sometimes it didn't happen at all, although the conditions remained the very same. So following this fieldwork and after joining the Technoscience Research Unit, I became much more interested in the health effects of preservatives and pesticides. In particular, I became interested in the use of endocrine disrupting chemicals such as DDT in museums because these kinds of chemicals represent a gendered and transgenerational violence. That is, exposure can happen at the source, such as through the handling of objects, but after you're exposed, after you absorb them, the chemicals store themselves in our fat cells. And the only known way to excrete large amounts of them is through pregnancy, when they cross the placenta, and during lactation, when they move out of storage in fat cells and show up in breast milk. In 1995, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, was amended to require museums and federal officials to tell recipients of repatriation about potential exposures to pesticides, preservatives, and other hazardous substances. The problem here is twofold. First, counting pesticides alone, there are more than 90 reported pesticides and innumerable combinations of cocktail mixtures to consider within the museum environment. And two, the practice of preparing Indigenous material culture for transportation, storage, and viewing is an enduring centuries-old practice, so common that records of the specific chemicals and treatments used and the specific materials that were even treated are rare. In the absence of records, studies have been limited to speculation about contamination, subjecting Indigenous material culture to further harmful and invasive practices and pesticide removal studies, and risk assessments of the museum environment itself. I am proposing that the contamination of Indigenous material culture within colonial collections necessitates alternative ways of understanding environmental violence through chemical exposures and provides us an opportunity to create a new environmental justice framework that explicitly extends into Indigenous material culture and foregrounds their extensive relations to land and body. As the Native Youth Sexual Health Network's toolkit of the same name makes clear, violence on the land is always violence on our bodies. And so, even more importantly, my research refuses the knowledge and data practices that act as allies to conventional understandings of environmental violence and contamination and offers alternatives to these practices, namely by creating that new environmental justice framework that accounts for Indigenous material culture as land and kin, which endures environmental pollution from within the built environment of the museum. Like industrial factories, reactors, refineries, mines, dump sites, and landfills, museums and cultural institutions operate along racialized geographies in which Indigenous material culture experiences disproportionate harm just because it is Indigenous, i.e., it is made of biological materials such as hide, leather, wool, sinew, etc., which according to the museum practices requires more invasive and toxic preservation strategies than other kinds of material culture. My project thus works with a set of premises, literatures, materials, and methods that together launch its aim of re-theorizing Indigenous feminist material culture and developing a new environmental justice framework that explicitly includes Indigenous material culture and built environments. It begins by activating seed beads and beadwork in two modes: as an archive of Indigenous feminist material culture that is capable of witnessing colonial violence, and as extensions of Indigenous land. It does so not only in order to better understand the complex institutional and industrial relations that characterize ongoing settler colonialism and colonial violence, but to open up difficult discussions about possibilities for repatriation and to create spaces of renewed possibility for Indigenous resistance in and through beading. Theorizing a land-based archive also opens up new questions and spaces for STS and Indigenous STS, as well as for environmental justice researchers, by challenging the distinction between material culture and land through Indigenous feminist models of non-human kinship. Finally, my project also counters colonial, gendered, and environmental violence within and outside of the built environment of the museum by emphasizing the possibilities for Indigenous feminist material culture under Indigenous feminist frameworks of care. It asks, or I ask, what futures of beadwork, survival, resistance, repatriation, and kinship are already being imagined and created by our communities? Okay, so I will close this.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful. So as people take in Kristen's thoughts and what she shared, please put your questions or reflections in the Q&A, and we'll we'll kind of take a few of those as we have time. But Kristen, maybe I could get the conversation started by asking you to say a bit more about what land means, because I think it's so it's so easy to think of beads as objects and then land as, for example, earth or lime or something like that. But I think you have a broader sense of what land is when you say beads are land. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to your understanding of that.
Sure. Thank you for this this question that is like a very long chunk of my dissertation.
You could just say a little bit.
You want me to speak to how beads are specifically land?
Well, I think, when you say land, you don't just mean dirt,
No.
right? You're not just saying beads are made of dirt and lime. You're saying something else. Land means something then is not just a material object itself. And so I'm wondering if you could just say more about that for the folks listening.
Sure. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so it's not just that beads are made of glass and that glass is made of silica, soda, and lime, which is, of course, falls under conventional understandings of land. It's that, I think my understanding of beads and land is meant to disrupt those actual conventional understandings of land, because I think under settler colonial knowledge regimes, especially with all of the resource extraction, once those resources come out of the land, they're resources. They're not land anymore. They're something we can buy and sell and own. And I'm trying to disrupt that. I'm trying to get us back to that point of actually, no, all of these materials, they come from somewhere. They belong to somewhere. They have specific place-based epistemologies and ontologies associated with them, and disrupting settler colonialism. I think the big work of Indigenous feminisms and Indigenous science, technology, and society is putting those relationships back into play, reanimating them, and speaking to them.
We have a first question from Waikea Male, and it's, what an amazing talk. Mahalo for doing and sharing this incredible work, Kristen. I'm writing about Indigenous material culture in Hawaii, and I'm interested in how you view Indigenous material culture through Indigenous science, technology studies. Science, technology, and society studies. Can you talk more about the importance of rematriating Indigenous people's material culture from the discipline of archaeology and ethnology, and also ripping away the object of, quote, the native from anthropological knowledge production to Indigenous science, technology, and science studies? And how is Indigenous feminist standpoint in the field vital for seeing, knowing, and relating to beads as more than just currency, commodity, and material culture?
Great. Sure. Thanks so much, Waikea. Yeah, okay, so as I briefly mentioned, I used to be an archaeologist. So my previous degrees are in archaeology. My PhD is going to be in anthropology, unfortunately, because it was just the easiest administratively field for me to move into from archaeology. And so my work with seed beads has really kind of evolved. I started working with Indigenous material culture when I was actually at Oxford. Up until that point, hadn't wanted to, I just lost the question. Oh, there, I got it. Up until that point, I hadn't wanted, I got it. Up until that point, I hadn't, I didn't want to work with Indigenous material culture in archaeology, specifically because of all of the objectification, exotic fetishization. I just found it so suffocating, right? And I didn't see any possibilities there. They always wanted me to talk about repatriation, right? What do you think about giving these objects back? That was always the focus. And when I was an archaeologist, I was always really troubled by how archaeologists would find, say, a cache of beads and then make a lot of very racist and stereotypical theories, judgments, conclusions about what that meant for that site, for those peoples, and for what happened there. And so then I did kind of give in. I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to fix what's going on. I'm gonna try to intervene. And I started working in the archives. And in the first iteration of this project, I wanted to go in, as many researchers do in archives, and I wanted to look at the materials and identify them and try to put them back into some sort of relationship with where they came from. And so for folks who don't know, obviously lots of the material culture that you see in museums or in cultural institutions was stolen. It lacks context, it lacks provenance. We often don't know who made it. And so that is vital work for researchers to go in and try to identify it. But when I was doing this work, I was really at a standstill because I didn't know what to do with all of it, actually. And I didn't know how to manage the violence that I experienced when I was doing this research in the archives. There was, of course, you know, the chemical violence, that chronic low-level violence that you don't feel until you get a nosebleed. But there were also, you know, opening drawers and finding like human remains scattered about, you know, like these sorts of experiences, just no care at all in the world. And so for a moment, I was thinking about repatriation, like what does this look like? How do you do it? What are some successful models of it? And then I realized that that's really tricky work too. And many people have been trying to do that for a long time. And so then I started thinking about, okay, so how do we rematriate this material within our own modes of understanding, within our own relations and responsibilities in the world? And then, so that's where I came to seed beads and was like, what can I do with you all together? How can I kind of bind you together with me and then put you back into relation with Indigenous feminisms, with land, with kin, and try to disrupt some of that anthropological knowledge production with something else. And so this is where kind of like Indigenous feminist standpoint specifically, and the methods that are being articulated now within Indigenous science, technology, and society really came in, because these methods are telling us, of course, there is more to these objects than just their value as currency or as a commodity or as a material culture. These are a part of our lives. When we handle them, we bring meaning to them. They affect us. Like I have an effective relationship with all my beadwork, you know? Does that answer your question?
And that made me think, Kristen, about your argument that beads are witnesses. And when you just describe there all the dimensions of being stolen, being dispersed forcefully, being taken out of relation, being put into paper and documentation regimes that are violent and then inadequate. And
can you speak right into the mic, Murphy? Your mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So thanks, Kristen. So is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering if you could say, like, in terms of the beating as witnessing, how that works in terms of like the museum collections.
Yeah, so as I said, like working with beads as witnesses, as a kind of research participant, I was trying to do a couple of things. So I was trying to get out of this genre of object biographies, which was immediately what my previous anthropological relations wanted me to do. They're like, okay, you're actually writing an object biography of seed beads. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm doing something else with them. And so Indigenous feminist standpoint, as well as Indigenous feminist frameworks that emphasize more than human kin and more than human kin's capacity to take in the world around us, or to attest to it, to witness in the longue durée, we might say, is what I'm trying to do with seed beads. And then, of course, you know, I feel I'm trying to find a way to also talk about a very intimate kind of violence in a way that it's going to not be extractive, right? I'm really was trying to like look around and see, well, what's here? What can we use to tell this story in a different way, in a new way, in a way that empowers us, and in a way that speaks to that persistence and that resistance, and that refusal settler colonialism and the violence of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I wonder too about, you know, it seems to me in your project, it's not just that the seed beads are acting as witnesses, but there is a kind of, like they are teachers.
Yeah.
They're offering learnings. And that works kind of against the extractive modalities that the university wants, you know, or tries to teach you to do. So I would be curious, and I think listeners would be curious to hear you talk more about what does it mean to take a non-extractive approach in this work. So it's not just that you're doing a non-damage based approach, but it's also, I think, crucially like a non-extractive approach, and that has like multiple dimensions.
For sure. So, so the academy and the production of knowledge in the academy is historically and continues to be based on modes of extraction. Researchers go into communities, they pull whatever data they want, whatever stories they want, whatever histories they want, and then they leave. And maybe they do something for that community, maybe they don't. It's very, it benefits the researcher, right? That's how it works. And so as a Indigenous STS scholar, and this connects to my work at the Technoscience Research Unit, where we are a bunch of Indigenous researchers and allied researchers investigating polluters and pollution and the state in allowing for that violence. And so there's a couple different ways that you can be non-extractive. So there is the very obvious one, which is that you are going to work with what you have. You're going to work with what is already in existence because that is enough. And I remember, like so many times this has been said to me, but especially when I was in a graduate course with Dr. Eve Tuck and a bunch of other brilliant Indigenous feminisms grad students, you know, there's enough of it. We know that there's so much data. We actually have way too much data. What we don't have is enough work that ties data to specific land body relations, to specific obligations, to specific protocols, to specific Indigenous laws, to specific regimes of extraction, right? There's not enough of that work. Kim Tallbear calls it studying up, right? Where you study power, you study whiteness, you study the institution, you study the data practices, the data collection practices. And so this project is really about making relations. It's about making relations with what there is to make relations with. And in that, it's a really generative space, actually. And I think the biggest part of non-extractive research is that the end result of it, you have to put back your data into its, you have to, we call it in the lab responsibilizing it. So you have to put it back into its proper relation. So if we're talking about pollution, that might look like putting pollution data back into relationship with Canada, with the Canadian government, with industry, with specific polluters, with the media ecologies or the computing infrastructures that help manage all of that data, right? It's about trying to make right.
We have another question from Marissa DeBorn, and it asks, can you speak more about the role of beads as participants and how you ethically approach those relations, especially in relation to these additional layers you are speaking of in terms of beads as lands and beads as relations from lands other than your own? Do you want me to read that one more time? Can you speak more about the role of beads as participants and how you ethically approach those relations?
Yeah, I think in approaching beads as participants, it really comes back to what Dr. Miley had asked earlier, which is how do we turn anthropological ways of knowledge production kind of on their head? How do we invert those and intervene in them? Because in the academy, if you're working in material culture studies, you're a researcher, a human being, and you're working on a material, and that material is inert. It's not active. It's not alive. It probably doesn't have agency, although there was the whole like agency turn in anthropology as well, but not in the way that our communities see them, not in the way that the sacred ontology outlines, which is that these beads are actually life-giving, that they have a spirit to them, that spirit connects to both their pre-colonial forms, but also helps materialize that future we're all working towards. And so I think ethically, how you approach those relations is actually approaching them as a research subject, like not actually approaching them as a material, which you can do certain things with materials that you can't do with people. And so what does it mean to bring that kind of framework, that kind of positioning to your research practice?
Wonderful. There's another question by Emily. It says, thank you so much, Dr. Bos, for sharing these histories and knowledges with us. I'm wondering if beads are transmitters of culture and knowledge, and some of the beads now used originate in places such as the Czech Republic and Japan. Is this also then a call to connect decolonial and Indigenous struggles transnationally? To think about the colonial histories of the people who make them as well? If yes, what might this look like?
Yeah, so I think it is like, again, this is like part of that project of putting data back into its relations, right? And really, when we are looking at transnational economies, when we are thinking about the manufacture of our goods, of our materials, that's not happening. That's mostly not happening in Canada, right? That's happening elsewhere. And so here I'm really trying to be in conversation with the many science and technology studies scholars who are looking at where things come from and what relationships those put us into conversation with us. So one example is Dr. Moya Bailey. Dr. Moya Bailey is looking at where iPhones are produced, where their materials to produce iPhones come from, where the raw materials come from, what the effect is on in those places. It is, of course, it is not to, I think it is to trace, it is to try to ethically trace power. And that will take us away from Turtle Island, but it'll also bring us back to it. And there are just like really interesting histories there. Like when I found out that, so the Czech Republic, there's lots of, the reason it happened there is because there is lots of sand. There's lots of silica sand that is perfect for glass making. There were really dense forests. And that is why the glass industry originates there and why it was so massive. And I remember when I found out that, I think I was looking at lots of museums have, they have these like original trade beads, like the beads that like Jacques Cartier had, and like they put them on display and it's so icky. And so I was looking, into the histories of these beads, and they take you to the same places. So in the Czech Republic, they take you to a place called Jablonek nad Nisou, which used to be called Gablenz. And yeah, they've been producing glass and glass seed beads there since 1548. Of course, there's very interesting histories in Venice. Columbus specifically got his beads from Venice. Yeah, it's just fascinating. And then in Japan specifically, lots of generative things to say there about imperialism, about fascism, about how those relations make their way into ours.
We have another question from our colleague Karen Recollet. And she says, I appreciate this presentation very much, Kristen, and you're thinking alongside Navarro and Harjo, whom I adore. I'm thinking about the constellating possibilities of seed gatherings as they form spaces that organize life and livingness. What kinds of gatherings are they asking of us to fall into relation with toxic kin relations and making relations with other more than human and human kin? How do beads constellate our gatherings? Or how can they? I wonder what kinds of futures they desire.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reckel. Me too. I also wonder what they desire. It's just me over here asking the beads what's up. Yeah, so I'll try to go through this question by question. So what kind of gatherings are they asking of us to fall into relation with toxic kin relations? And so here, yeah, so I did want to speak to more of this because I have had some feedback that's like, okay, so you're saying that the materials are toxic, that they're going to harm us, that the beads are toxic, that they're going to harm us. And what I want to try to get at, what I try to articulate more on paper is that, I mean, it really gets into purity myths, right? Like it really gets into this narrative of what is a chemical pollutant? What does it do? Where is it from? When are we exposed? How are we exposed? We are always in relation to toxic kin relations, we might call them. We live in the city. We live under intense industrialization, and so do our non-human kin, so does our material culture. And in this provocation, like I am really also engaging yours and Aaron Consumo's work, right? In meeting the lands where they're at. You know, how do we bring practices of harm reduction to our research? How do we acknowledge that not everything, you know, with Indigenous studies, there's always, not Indigenous studies, sorry, within Indigenous studies, within anthropology, within those archaeology, within those fields, there is this like positioning to the before, this like pure, non-toxic, like untouched positioning. And I really want to get us away from that too. I think it's so pervasive. And I think when we start to actually think about what is a chemical pollutant, and where do we find them, we find ourselves in a very messy situation. And I think that messiness is generative. And I think it's a little bit more realistic. And how do beads constellate our gatherings, or how can they? I think, and this is where like earlier, Dr. DeBorn asked about how do you ethically engage a research participant? And actually your question, Dr. Recollet, really, this is one of like actually the one of the ways that beads show us their agency, which is that they do constellate our gatherings. They do bring us together. They almost demand it, you might think, right? If you've ever beaded with someone, if you've ever gone to a beading circle, even just beading alone, you need help. And so they bring us into conversations, they bring us into spaces. That's what they're doing. And yeah, I wonder what kinds of futures they desire too. One thing I didn't talk about, which I do talk about in my manuscript, is I go a little bit deeper into my field work. And I am, you know, as a researcher, I don't know how to frame this. I'm thinking about the chemical exposures of European curators through many different lenses. And one lens I like to think about is specifically through an idea of revenge. You know, what does it look like? What does it look like to think about revenge in a context like the museum, where objects collected, stolen centuries ago, doused with chemicals, are harming their collectors, we may think of them as. And so I think there's a lot to do with toxic kin relations, that it's not always bad.
Well, I think that kind of connects to another question by Vasiliki, and I'm just going to kind of like paraphrase her question, or their question. So they were asking about, you know, saying that they had taken a class and learned about treaties and learned about like wampum belts as a kind of treaty form. And so was interested about the kind of duality between colonial legal structures as a kind of treaty form, and beading, right, as a kind of other, or wampum belts as another kind of treaty form. And that made me, you know, when you were talking, answering Dr. Recollet's question, thinking about like, well, what kind of gatherings do beadings make? It made me think about this other form of treaty making that is not at all like a paper terms of service contract. So I'm wondering if you might want to say something about beadwork or beading or gatherings as part of kind of Indigenous legal traditions and Indigenous relation making.
Yeah. Well, I think you just said a lot of it, which is that, yeah, it's not just that beads, you know, they bring us into these gathering spaces and we gather and we drink tea and we like, we gossip, we do all these things. Like, it's actually a different form of governance, right? It's more akin to an Indigenous form of governance. It is anti-colonial in a lot of ways. It's beading, if you're a beader, or you've ever, I don't know, bought lots of beadwork or been gifted beadwork, it is anti-capitalist in a lot of ways, right? It's, you make things, maybe you don't know who they're for, or maybe you are just making it to make it. It's a gift, right? It's a process of gifting. And so it is not just that we come together and make these beautiful things, it's that we are engaging in anti-capitalist practices, in anti-colonial practices as well. And yeah, I mean, I'm not Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee, but of course, beads and wampum belts govern the lands on which I work. They govern the lands on which I live. And it's important for us to think about that and to try to reanimate that with our research and in our practices.
So there's a question from Rena asking, first thanking you for your brilliant talk and asking if you might share a little bit about your own practices of beading influence your scholarship.
For sure. Yeah, so I beaded as a kid. I stopped when I was a teenager, came back to it a little bit later. I'm not, so Métis beadwork often happens, you know, it's hide work, it's embroidery. I am not so good at those. I am more of a loom worker. And so I bead on the loom. I like the straight lines. I like the control. That probably tells you a little bit more about my personality than my scholarship. But I think, you know, Dr. Lana Ray talks about this, and Dr. Carmen Robertson also talks about this, that there is a stillness to beading, that it takes you, when you bead, you just focus on the beading. As academics, especially as theorists, you know, it's easy to get into the clouds or into the weeds. And I find beading a really grounding practice. I can't really think about something else if my thread is tangled. Like, I can't, like, that's it. That's the focus. And so I guess it is just a grounding practice, as many other people also have articulated.
And this is a comment from Valley. So more of a comment than a question, but I thought was quite beautiful. So it says, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was really moved by beads as witness. I'm wondering if you can speak a bit on reciprocity or maybe genealogy in witnessing, witnessing as a gesture of collective kinship. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the beadworking as an act of witnessing, then the beads themselves as also engaged in their own acts of witnessing, a reciprocal act of witnessing, the beadworkers witnessing and also participating in the work. And further, what Murphy discussed as beads as a witness to theft, what they are witnessing in the archives or museums, or to the long half-lives of chemicals. And then you as a researcher witnessing and teaching material culture in this talk.
We are just witnessing and witnessing. We are that information and sensory. No, 100%. I love this question. Yeah, so the genealogy and witnessing. Yeah, so that is kind of one of the really awesome things that we can do when we turn to material culture to see beads and beadwork in this way, is we have that ability to see over a longer expanse of time, right? Longer than our own lives. And we also are able to connect our lives, the materials with different genealogies. And so there is, I think also we need to think about witnessing as a feminist ethic, right? As a feminist method. How do we witness and document and record and archive the world around us for future generations in a way that will be helpful for future generations? And I think beadwork actually does that in a lot of ways, especially because beadwork is something that it goes into collections, or it stays within people's own personal collections. Like, it gets passed down. And so further, what are they witnessing? What they're witnessing in the archives? Yeah, and I think you know, beads and chemicals. It really wasn't until I saw Ruth Cuthand's work, specifically her trading series. So if you haven't seen it, look it up. And in her trading series, she beads the 12 first diseases that were exchanged during colonization, 11 from Europe and one hypothesized from here to go back to Europe. And for her, like, beads and viruses go hand in hand because of their relationship in trade, right? Like, beads were on all the ships, they were in all the inventories, and so they were able to kind of act as vehicles for those diseases, right? The beads themselves, as captivating technologies, put colonizers into close relation with Indigenous peoples. And so then that's when I started to think about not just this trade relationship between beads and viruses, but that the beads themselves were made of specific chemicals, and that the beads themselves were then exposed to specific chemicals. And what could that tell us about what it means to be a witness to colonial violence and to environmental violence, right? We don't often think, or where people are starting to think of environmental violence in much more tangible and material and proximate ways. And I think that's what beads can also bring us into.
And I thank you for that, Kristen. And I can't help but think about Marissa DeBourne's question about beads as participants bringing us into ethical relations. And I think your project, I always learn so much, every time I hear you talk about beads, and the kind of challenge of what if we kind of approach beads or other beings as research participants,
right?
Then how do we manifest reciprocity? And I think you are kind of showing us some of the ways of doing that. So I really thank you.
And as like,
so we're basically at our.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I was just
no,
gonna say,
go on.
like, I was just gonna continue on this like co-conspirator thing, right? That it's not like that there can be this kind of like sneaky ulterior, like settler colonial disrupting relationship to it as well.
Right. The reciprocity can be that you're co-conspiring, against colonialism together. Yeah, it's beautiful. So I want to thank you so much. I don't know if you want to have like a last word, or if that's a good last word.
I'm good.
Okay, great. I think we asked a lot of you already tonight. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your work, sharing your thinking, bringing us into these kind of complex and beautiful and challenging invitations to being in a kind of better relations with our research, including research forms that the university wants us to see as inanimate or as merely objects. So I really thank you for that. And I thank everyone for coming here tonight. And I thank everyone for asking such lovely questions. I want to also, though, remind everyone that on Friday at noon, WGSI is going to be hosting a community roundtable on anti-Asian racism and intersectional violence. And this is posted now in our chat, and that it's almost at capacity, but it will be live streamed. So if you can't get into it via the Zoom webinar registering, go to the WGSI website homepage, and we'll be live streaming this important event that's coming up on Friday. And again, that's Friday at noon. So I wish we were in person so that we could all like clap and smile and show Kristen our appreciation for sharing with us today. I like to like do this on like Zoom, like the kind of like weird clapping. But so thank you, Kristen, and thank you everybody. And I guess we'll say goodbye and thank you to everyone who came tonight.
Yeah, Chimigos, have a great night.